Somewhere in the North Atlantic, roughly 1,000 years ago, a longship is running before the wind. The crew has been at sea long enough that the coast is a memory, and the next landfall is still a guess. The oars are shipped, the sail is full, and somewhere near the stern a man stands up and begins to speak. He is not a sailor in the ordinary sense, though he knows ships well enough to survive on one. He is a skald, a professional poet attached to a chieftain or a king, trained to hold entire histories inside his memory and release them in precisely measured verse. The crew goes quiet. Even in the cold, even with the spray coming over the bow, they listen. Because out here, on open water, with nothing but horizon in every direction, a good story is worth more than almost anything else a man can carry. That image sits at the centre of everything this episode is about. We know that Viking skalds performed on longships. We know they used dense, intricate poetic forms called skaldic verse, built around kenningar, compressed metaphors that turned a ship into a horse of the waves and the sea into a road of the whale. We know that oral storytelling was not a casual pastime in the Viking world, but a living system for transmitting history, reinforcing identity, and holding a crew together across months of difficult sailing. What we do not always ask is, which stories were they actually telling out there, on the open water, and why did those particular stories survive? That is the question this episode is built around. The answer pulls in 4 major saga traditions. The first is the Vinland Sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Erik the Red, which recount Norse voyages to the coast of North America somewhere between 970 and 1030. These were not written down until between 1220 and 1280, composed in Iceland from oral traditions that had been passed from ship to ship and settlement to settlement for generations. They are the most detailed medieval accounts of transatlantic exploration that exist anywhere in the world, and they contain the kind of information that only survives when sailors talk to other sailors. The second tradition is Heimskringla, the great saga of the Norwegian kings compiled by Snorri Sturluson around 1230. Snorri was working from older verses and oral accounts, and embedded in his narrative are some of the most vivid shipbuilding descriptions anywhere in medieval literature, along with the names of legendary longships, Ormurinn Langi, the Long Serpent, that crews would have known the way later generations knew the names of famous warships. These were not just stories about kings, they were stories about the vessels themselves, about the wood and the rigging and the men who drove them across the North Sea. The third tradition is the Orkneyinga Saga, the history of the earls of Orkney, first set down in the late 12th or early 13th century. This is a saga built from the sea roads, the crossings between Norway, the Northern Isles, the British coasts, and the Baltic. It blends oral legend, praise poetry, and hard historical fact in a way that shows exactly how Norse storytelling adapted itself to the specific geography of wherever Norse ships happened to be sailing. And the fourth thread running through this episode is the broader body of skaldic verse and voyage narrative that connects all 3. The verse is about sea battles, about storms survived and coasts sighted, about the particular experience of being a small wooden ship on a very large ocean. There is a complication worth naming right now because it matters for everything that follows. None of the stories as they were actually heard on Viking longships survive. What we have are the written versions, set down decades or centuries after the events they describe, filtered through scribal hands that sometimes had reasons, religious, political, literary, to reshape what they copied. The oral versions exist only as echoes inside the manuscripts, visible in certain rhythms and repeated phrases and narrative patterns that suggest the spoken original behind the written page. So when we talk about stories told on Viking voyages, we're always working with reconstruction as much as record. That reconstruction, though, is not guesswork. It is built from 3 different kinds of evidence working together. There is the textual evidence of the sagas themselves, read carefully against the grain. There is the archaeological evidence, most dramatically the site at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, which confirmed that the Vinland voyages described in the sagas were real journeys to a real place, not literary invention. And there is the experimental evidence from modern reconstructions, including the 2007 voyage of the Sea Stallion from Glendalough, a full-scale replica longship that crossed from Denmark to Dublin. The crew of that vessel kept diaries, and what they recorded was striking. During the long windless stretches of open water, people sang, people recited verse, people told stories, not as entertainment added to the voyage, but as something closer to survival equipment. a direct echo of what the skalds were doing 1,000 years before. This episode is going to move between all of those layers: legend and archaeology, maritime life and literary history, the voices that made it across the water in writing and the ones that almost certainly did not. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. Now, let's put a skald on a longship and figure out what he was actually saying. The word skald comes down to us already carrying weight. These were not wandering storytellers who happened to climb aboard ships for the ride. They were trained professionals, court poets whose entire social function depended on the precision of their memory and the authority of their voice. A skald attached to a king or chieftain was expected to compose and perform in a form called drotkvet, one of the most technically demanding poetic structures in the medieval world, built on internal rhyme, alliteration, and syllable count so rigid that a single misplaced stress could ruin a stanza. Learning it took years. Performing it from memory, in the right order, in front of an audience that knew the material well enough to notice errors, that was not a casual skill. It was a craft, and the men who held it were valued accordingly. Their primary function was praise. A skald witnessed a battle, a voyage, a political alliance, and turned it into verse that could outlast the event itself. Before a fight, a skald might stand up and recite the deeds of his patron's ancestors, not as background reading, but as a direct injection of courage into the men about to row toward an enemy coastline. The verse was the record and the rallying cry simultaneously, and because the form was so demanding, so precisely constructed, it resisted casual alteration. A kenning-laden drotkvet stanza was almost impossible to paraphrase without destroying it. You either remembered it correctly or you admitted you had lost it. That structural stubbornness is part of why approximately 967 stanzas of skaldic verse, dated securely between 950 and 1110, survived long enough to be written down in 12th and 13th century manuscripts. The form itself was the preservation mechanism. Now put that person on a longship 3 weeks from the nearest shore and consider what his value becomes. A Norse crew on a long ocean crossing faced conditions that tested morale in very particular ways. The physical danger everyone understands: storm, wave, cold, exhaustion. But there were also the long stretches of nothing, calms when the sail hung slack and the men sat at the oars for hours, moving slowly across water that gave nothing back, fog that swallowed the horizon and made it impossible to know whether they were covering ground or drifting, the peculiar psychological weight of open water, which is not the same as fear but compounds fear when fear eventually arrives. The crew of the Sea Stallion, the reconstructed longship that crossed from Denmark to Dublin in 2007, kept detailed records of exactly this experience. During the slow, windless passages, they sang, they told stories, they recited verse to each other not because anyone had scheduled entertainment, but because silence on open water has a quality that people instinctively push back against. 1,000 years earlier, the skald was the deliberate professional answer to that instinct. But the skald's role went deeper than morale. The stories he carried were also the crew's collective identity. Norse society ran on kinship, reputation, and the memory of ancestral deeds, and a longship crew was a compressed version of that society. Men from different farmsteads and clans, sometimes different regions, bound together by the authority of their chieftain and the shared risk of the voyage. The sagas that King's poetry was eventually embedded into were not neutral histories. They were arguments about who mattered and why, which families deserved respect, which leaders had earned their standing through real action. Hearing those stories at sea reinforced a crew's sense of where they stood in a larger world that they could not currently see. Here it is worth drawing a distinction that matters for everything that follows in this episode. Skaldic verses, those dense formal stanzas, were the raw material, individual moments crystallized into memorable form. The saga tradition that grew around them was something larger, extended prose narratives that wove the verses in as evidence, as quotation, as proof that events had actually happened. Scholars describe the king's sagas as texts that frequently quote verse, invariably occasional praise poetry in the form of skaldic verse. The verse was the eyewitness testimony. The prose narrative around it was the interpretation. Together they formed a system where oral performance was not separate from historical record, but was the record, the living version that mattered most before any scribe ever picked up a pen. That original life of this material, heard, not read, performed in the wind rather than copied by lamplight, is easy to forget when you are looking at a manuscript page, but it is the only context in which any of it makes sense. The sagas were not written to be read silently by individuals sitting alone. They were shaped by voices, calibrated for listeners, tuned to the specific acoustics of ships and halls, and the particular attention of people who had nowhere else to be. So what exactly did those listeners want to hear? The answer is not as obvious as it might seem. You might assume that men exhausted from rowing would want escape. Stories of warm halls, safe harbours, dry land, and the comfort of things left behind. But the evidence points the other way. The stories that survived, the ones that got retold often enough to eventually be written down, were saturated with the sea itself. Storms appeared constantly. Landfalls were described with a precision that went beyond poetry into something closer to instruction. Omens involving the colour of water, the behaviour of birds, the sudden slackening of swells near a hidden coastline. These recurred not as decoration, but as structural elements of the narrative. The crews on those ships wanted stories about the sea because they were on the sea, and those stories did something that mere distraction could never do. They made sense of where the crew was and what might happen next. There is a practical dimension here that is easy to underestimate. Viking navigation in the open ocean was entirely oral in its transmission. The pilots who guided longships across the North Atlantic, called ledsagnameter, men of way knowledge, carried their expertise not in charts or written directions but in layered memory. They read the sky, tracked the angle of the sun at noon, watched for specific birds at specific distances from specific coasts, noted the feel of current changes beneath the hull, and interpreted the colour and clarity of the water as the depth changed near unfamiliar shores. All of that knowledge had been passed from one generation of pilots to the next, through speech, through story, through the repeated rehearsal of what a particular stretch of water looked like when you were running it correctly versus when you were about to find rocks. The voyages to Greenland, roughly 2,000 miles of open ocean from the Norwegian coast, produced oral sailing directions that were embedded in the stories themselves. When a saga described a sea that suddenly went slack, or a sky that turned a specific shade before weather arrived, it was not being poetic, it was being useful. That dual function, entertainment and practical knowledge held in the same breath, shaped everything about how maritime stories were constructed. A tale that described a successful landfall in precise geographic terms gave any man in the audience who later sailed that route a mental template to match against what he actually saw. A story about a chieftain who ignored the darkening of the water and lost his ship was a cautionary episode with immediate operational value. The moral and the practical were inseparable, because the world those stories described was one where bad decisions at sea killed everyone aboard, not just the man who made the mistake. Saga themes did not drift towards storms, omens, and survival by accident. They were drawn there by the continuous selective pressure of audiences who needed those themes and returned to them again and again until they became the load-bearing structures of the form. Now consider the setting in which all of this was actually happening. A Viking longship under sail or oar was a narrow, open vessel. There was no interior, no separation between the crew and the conditions. The men sat or lay along the same planks in which their oars were set. In bad weather, water came over the sides and had to be bailed continuously. In fog, every man watched and said nothing. In prolonged calms, the physical monotony of rowing, the same stroke repeated hour after hour, produced a kind of mental vacancy that the skald's voice cut directly through. Skaldic verses praised exactly this work. They described rowing through long stretches in poor weather as a heroic act, compared the rhythmic fall of oars to the beat of eagles' wings, noted the ship's flexible hull as it moved through heavy seas, that lissom quality of a well-built longship that did not fight the wave but bent with it, which was terrifying to a new sailor and reassuring to an experienced one once he understood it. The verse validated what the crew was experiencing in the moment it was being experienced, which is a particular kind of power that no story told entirely in the past tense can achieve. The longship was also, by necessity, a place of intense camaraderie. There was no privacy. Everyone heard the same things, felt the same cold, ate the same food, lived inside the same sustained proximity for weeks or months at a time. That compression changed how stories worked. When a skald stood up, or sat up more likely given the space, and began a recitation, Every man in earshot became part of the same audience simultaneously. There was no drifting away, no back corner of the room to stand in. The story reached all of them at once, and they shared the response. A moment of suspense landed on 30 men at the same time. A line that drew laughter broke the tension for everyone who needed it broken. The emotional force of oral performance in an enclosed shared space is something that reading a manuscript cannot replicate, but the evidence from the Sea Stallion reconstruction gives us a shadow of it. The modern crew, sailing the same waters, discovered that storytelling and song were not optional leisure, but the actual mechanism by which a group of people who were cold, tired, and uncertain about tomorrow held themselves together as a functioning crew rather than a collection of miserable individuals. The themes that accumulated around this sustained pressure were specific. Feuds appeared constantly, not because Viking life was uniquely violent, though it was often violent, but because a feud narrative provided a moral structure that made cause and effect legible. A man dishonoured his neighbour. The neighbour waited. The reckoning came. That arc, repeated across dozens of sagas with dozens of variations, taught something about how consequences worked and how a man was expected to meet them. On a ship where the men around you would be the ones who had to fight alongside you when you made landfall somewhere uncertain, that moral instruction was not abstract. It was preparation. The sagas that stayed in circulation were the ones that answered real questions. How does a man behave when the odds turn against him? What does honour actually require when survival is also at stake? Those questions had no academic distance on a longship. They were live questions, possibly urgent ones, and the stories that engaged them directly were the ones worth hearing again. The darkness compounded everything. Winter voyages, or even late autumn passages in northern latitudes, meant long stretches of sailing in near total darkness, or in the pale half-light that the far north offers as its version of day, cold that reached into the hands and made the simplest task take longer than it should. The horizon that might be clear at midday and completely obscured by the time anyone thought to look again. Uncertainty about position, about weather, about what lay ahead, all of it present simultaneously and not resolvable by effort or intelligence, only by patience and endurance. Into that atmosphere, a story about a navigator who read the signs correctly and brought his ship through, or a crew that held together through catastrophe and reached land alive, did not simply entertain. It provided a model. It showed what the thing looked like when it was done right, and in doing so, it made doing it right slightly more imaginable for the men listening. This is why the sea did not just provide a backdrop for these stories. It generated their logic, their themes, their moral architecture, and their practical content. The longship was not merely where the stories happened to be told, it was the instrument that determined which stories mattered and which were forgotten, which details got sharpened through retelling and which fell away. Centuries of voyages conducted under the same physical conditions with the same psychological pressures produced a literature calibrated so precisely to its context that even after it was eventually written down and placed on manuscript pages in warm Icelandic scriptoria, the cold and the dark and the uncertain horizon are still there in the language, still structuring the way events are described and judged. The sea did not shape Viking stories from the outside, it shaped them from inside the stories themselves. That shaping process had a precise technical instrument, the skaldic verse. While the sagas as we know them are prose narratives, their roots reach down into a much older and more rigidly structured poetic tradition. The skalds, the court poets and ship poets of the Viking world, composed verses governed by rules so exact that a stanza with even one syllable wrong was simply not a valid stanza. The dominant meter was called drotkvet, and it fixed not only syllable count but the placement of alliteration, the pattern of internal rhyme, and the interplay of assonance within each half-line. This was not decoration, it was engineering. A verse built to those specifications became, in the words of scholars who have studied the surviving corpus, something that could survive in more or less its original form across generations of oral transmission, because any deviation from the pattern was immediately audible as a flaw. The meter itself was the error correction system. The numbers are striking. Somewhere in the range of 967 identifiable stanzas survive from compositions spanning roughly the 9th to the 13th centuries, preserved in manuscripts written down generations after the verses were first spoken. That they survived at all, in recoverable form, is a direct consequence of that strict metrical constraint. Prose drifts. Memory softens edges, drops phrases, substitutes convenient synonyms, and gradually reshapes a narrative until the original contours are almost unrecognizable. A Drotkvet stanza resists all of that because any alteration breaks the pattern, and breaking the pattern is perceptible to any listener who knows the form. The meter kept the verses honest across time in a way that prose simply could not. And what the verses were honest about again and again was the sea and the ships that crossed it. The poetic language the skalds developed for maritime life was a world unto itself, built around a device called the kenning, a compressed metaphorical compound that replaced a plain noun with an image. Ships did not appear in skaldic verse as ships. They appeared as wave horses, sea stallions, long sea trees. The ocean was not the ocean but the whale road, the seal bath, the field of the gull. A warrior was a feeder of ravens, a reddener of the sword. These kennings were not merely ornamental. They were the vocabulary of a mental world in which ships moved like living creatures, in which the ocean was a landscape with its own geography and its own inhabitants, and in which the crossing of water was an act that belonged to the same category of experience as battle, demanding, dangerous, and worthy of being rendered in language equal to its weight. Some of these images carried precise technical information inside the metaphor. Or strokes described in verse as resembling the beating of an eagle's wings gave any listener who had pulled an oar a physiological recognition. The same rhythm, the same lift and fall, the same exhaustion that accumulated over hours until the arms stopped feeling like arms. Mast heights that could reach 21 meters or more appear in the verses not as engineering specifications, but as measures of a ship's power and ambition, translated into the language of prestige. The flexibility of a well-built longship, that unsettling essential quality of bending with the wave rather than resisting it, appears in verse through words that translate roughly as lissom, a term that carries both physical description and something almost like admiration for a hull that behaved like a living body rather than a rigid structure. The poem was technical document and praise song simultaneously. Egil Skallagrimsson, one of the most celebrated poets and one of the more terrifying personalities in the entire saga tradition, left verses that cut directly to the bone of what ship life meant in practice. In one of his Losa Visur, occasional verses composed in the heat of a lived experience rather than for formal performance, he speaks of a proud oared ship, of standing at the stem, of steering, of cutting a man down. The verse is compressed and violent and specific in the way that first-hand knowledge makes things specific. This is not a court poet describing a battle he heard about from a safe distance. It is someone reporting from inside the experience, using a meter strict enough to preserve the report more or less intact across the centuries that separated composition from manuscript. That directness is part of what makes skaldic verse so valuable and so dangerous as a historical source simultaneously. The value is obvious. Concrete details of maritime practice embedded in a form designed to survive. Crew organisation appears in the terminology, skippen, sogn, lid, terms that illuminate how men were arranged and commanded aboard a longship. Ship dimensions, sail handling, the feel of a hull in heavy seas, all of it encoded in the verses, compressed into kennings and half-lines that require unpacking, but yield genuine information when they are carefully read. Historians reconstructing Viking maritime conditions return to these poems not because they are the most accessible sources, but because they are often the most specific, preserving details that no prose chronicle thought to record. The danger is equally obvious, and scholars are careful about it. Skaldic verse is an art form, not a technical manual. The kenning that describes a ship as a sea stallion tells you something real about how the Vikings understood the relationship between speed and power and beauty in a longship, but it does not tell you how many strakes the hull had, or what species of wood was used for the keel. The Drottvet meter preserves the words, but it also shapes them, requiring that certain syllables land in certain places, which means the poet sometimes reached for the kenning that fit the pattern, rather than the term that was most precisely accurate. Reading skaldic verse as if it were direct testimony, flattening the poetry into a list of facts, produces exactly the kind of distortion that the verses themselves were never designed to prevent. The honest approach holds both things at once. The verse is a literary object and a historical document, and those two qualities are not in conflict, but are fused together in a way that cannot be separated without losing both, A kenning-like wave horse does not simply mean ship in a poetic way. It means ship, and it also means something about how a ship in motion felt to the man aboard it. The sensation of a hull rising over a swell and descending into a trough, as if the vessel itself were running, as if the water beneath it were a surface a horse could cross. That experiential content is historical information. It tells us something about what crossing the ocean meant to the people who did it, and that is not a lesser form of knowledge than knowing hull dimensions. What the strict meter guaranteed was not perfect factual accuracy, but something more durable, continuity of tone and texture across time. The verses that survived into the manuscripts carried with them the emotional register of the men who composed them, the mixture of pride and pragmatism that characterized Viking maritime culture, the praise for physical endurance rendered in language that made endurance beautiful rather than merely exhausting. A crew listening to a well-performed Drottkvet stanza about a sea crossing did not receive a navigation report. They received a version of their own experience elevated into art, made memorable, given a form that would survive the voyage and all the voyages after it, so that men who had never been on that particular crossing could nonetheless recognize exactly what it was to have been there. That is the true function of the verse as a transmitted object. It moved through time the way a longship moved through water, shaped for the purpose, flexible enough to survive the conditions, carrying something essential in its hold. What those verses eventually fed, generation by generation, was a larger narrative tradition. The strict stanzas were the seed stock from which the prose sagas grew. A poem preserved a battle, a crossing, a landfill, a death. A later storyteller took the poem as evidence, as confirmation, as the authoritative kernel around which a longer account could be built. And gradually across the decades the individual verses began to accumulate into something larger, something that could hold the full arc of a voyage, a life, a dynasty, an age of exploration. The question of exactly how that transformation happened, and what was preserved and what was invented in the process, runs through every saga we still read today. The verses were the beginning. What came next was the saga itself. For centuries, that transformation from verse to saga happened entirely without ink. The process was slow, cumulative, and mostly invisible to us now. A skald composed a stanza about a crossing. Another poet heard it, remembered it, and later used it as the authoritative centre of a longer spoken account. The battle that preceded the voyage, the landfall that followed it, the king who ordered the ships built in the first place. An audience heard that account on a winter evening in a hall in Iceland, and someone in that audience remembered the shape of it, adjusted a detail here, added a genealogy there, and carried a version of it forward into the next generation. This is how oral culture works everywhere it has ever existed, and Iceland was no exception. The material was alive, constantly breathed upon by new voices, new circumstances, new political pressures. It moved. The first significant disruption to that movement came not from within Norse culture but from outside it, wearing the robes of the church. Christianity arrived in Iceland formally around the year 1000, and with it came Latin literacy, schools, ecclesiastical administration, the alphabet itself. Icelandic scholars did something remarkable with that imported technology. Rather than use it exclusively for Latin texts, they adapted it to write their own language. The first secular document committed to writing in Iceland was a law book, set down in the winter of 1117 to 1118. It was a practical act with enormous consequences. If law could be written, so could history. If history could be written, so could the stories of kings, voyages, settlements, and the men who shaped them. The age of the written saga had begun, though it would take another century and a half to fully take hold. By around 1300, the great flowering of Icelandic prose literature, what scholars call the classical saga age, had produced the texts we still read today. But the century and a half between 1118 and the mature sagas of the late 1200s was not a clean transfer from one medium to another. It was a negotiation, and a complicated one. The scribes who first began writing were not neutral archivists. They were men of the church, educated in a tradition that had its own ideas about how history should be shaped, what moral framework should govern the telling of events, and which human virtues deserved celebration. When a Christian-educated scribe sat down to record an oral account of a pagan raid or a sea crossing undertaken by men who sacrificed to Odin and Thor, he made choices. Some of those choices were editorial, trimming details that seemed theologically problematic, inserting phrases that implied divine providence where an earlier storyteller might have credited fate or luck. Others were political. The early scribes were often connected to powerful Icelandic families, the great clans that were consolidating wealth and influence during precisely the same period when the written word was becoming a new kind of authority. A family that controlled the written version of a founding ancestor's deeds controlled something valuable, a claim, a precedent, a usable past. Gisli Sigurdsson, one of the foremost scholars of medieval Icelandic literature, has documented how the oral tradition underwent the whole range of modification, loss and accretion before and during the period of writing. That phrase repays careful attention. Modification means that details changed, not necessarily through dishonesty but through the natural process of retelling, in which a speaker emphasizes what matters to his audience and quietly drops what does not. Loss means that entire threads of the original material simply did not survive the transmission. Verses that no one remembered well enough, episodes that seemed peripheral and were left behind. Accretion means that new material attached itself to old cores. A story about a sea voyage might accumulate an additional character, a legendary episode, a genealogical connection that linked it more usefully to the family of a powerful patron. By the time any given saga reached the scribe's desk, it had already passed through generations of exactly this kind of shaping. What the scribe then added was a further layer: the conventions of written narrative, the influence of European literary models, the subtle but pervasive pressure of Christian moral categories. The result was a document that drew on genuine oral memory, but cannot be read as a simple transcript of what men once said aboard ships crossing the North Atlantic. This is the crux of the problem that has occupied saga scholars for well over a century, and it remains genuinely unresolved. On one side of the debate sit those who argue that the sagas preserve substantial historical memory, that the oral tradition was more stable than its detractors believe, that the strong cultural prestige of accurate recitation created real incentives against invention, and that the archaeological record repeatedly confirms what the texts describe. The discovery of Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, corroborating Norse presence in North America exactly where the Vinland Sagas place it, is the most dramatic example of a saga detail surviving the transition from shipboard story to written text with its geographical core essentially intact. If that could survive, the argument goes, then much else may have survived as well. On the other side sit those who point to the degree of literary shaping visible in the surviving texts. The narrative symmetry is too neat to be accidental, the character types borrowed from European romance tradition, the miraculous episodes that reflect Christian hagiography more than Norse oral tradition, the suspiciously perfect speeches delivered at suspiciously dramatic moments. These scholars argue that the saga authors of the 13th century were not merely transcribing the past but actively constructing it, using oral material as raw lumber to build literary structures of their own design. On this reading, the sagas tell us far more about 13th century Icelandic concerns and literary conventions than about 10th century voyages. What makes this debate so difficult to resolve is the same thing that makes it so productive. The shipboard originals are gone. No one recorded what a skald actually said on a longship crossing the Denmark Strait. No one transcribed the version of the Erik the Red story that circulated in Greenland's earlier settlements, spoken by men who had seen the western shore with their own eyes. The verses give us fragments, compressed, formally preserved, historically suggestive, but the living context of their performance, the exact words in which the surrounding prose narrative was shaped, the nuances that a skilled oral performer could convey through timing and emphasis and variation, all of that dissolved into the air of the North Atlantic centuries before anyone thought to write it down. What we have are the written descendants of those performances, several generations removed and shaped by every hand that touched them along the way. And yet, the sagas that survived are extraordinary objects precisely because they carry this layered complexity. Every reading of the Vinland Sagas is simultaneously a reading of 10th century voyaging experience, 13th century literary ambition, ecclesiastical editorial pressure, and the long oral tradition that connected the two ends of that chain. The uncertainty does not diminish the texts. It makes them richer, more resistant to easy summary, more genuinely interesting as historical and literary artifacts. A document that is nothing but straightforward fact is a ledger. A document that is the product of centuries of telling and retelling and writing and rewriting, carrying all of that history in its very structure, is something considerably more alive. The scholars who have spent careers working on the problem, Sigurdsson, Theodor Andersen, and many others, tend to arrive at a position that honours both possibilities simultaneously. Oral memory and literary invention are not opposites in the saga tradition. They are collaborators. The voice of the skald on the longship and the hand of the Christian scribe in the scriptorium both contributed to the text that now sits on a library shelf, and neither contribution can be cleanly separated from the other without destroying what makes the whole thing remarkable. What the sagas are, in the end, is evidence of how a seafaring culture understood itself, not the unmediated reality of the voyages, but the stories those voyages became when people who cared about them tried to make them last. And some of those stories are extraordinary. One of the most extraordinary begins with a man banished twice over, Erik Thorvaldsson, known everywhere he went as Erik the Red, a name that referred to his hair and possibly to his temperament, had a talent for violence that repeatedly outran whatever tolerance the community around him could manage. His father had been exiled from Norway for manslaughter. Erik himself was driven out of Iceland around 982 AD after killing again, a chain of feuds and retaliations that ended with a judgment of outlawry and a sentence of 3 years' exile from the island. He took his family, his ships, and whatever rumour had reached him of a coastline glimpsed to the west, and he sailed from the glacier-shadowed cape of Snæfellsjökull into water that most people considered the edge of the navigable world. What he found was an enormous, mostly inhospitable landmass ringed with ice, with a narrow western coast where the glaciers gave way to fjords green enough in summer to graze cattle. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring it systematically, naming the inlets and headlands, assessing the pasture and the hunting. When he returned to Iceland, he called the place Greenland, a deliberate choice, a piece of early real estate promotion designed to attract settlers who might otherwise hesitate at the name alone. It worked. Around 985 or 986, Erik led a colonizing fleet of 25 ships out from Iceland toward the new territory. Storms battered them. 14 ships made it. That first eastern settlement at Brattahlid, where Erik built his homestead, would grow over the following generations to a population of several thousand. The westernmost European outpost in the world, perched on the edge of a continent no one from the Old World yet suspected was there. This is the chain the saga of Erik the Red follows, and it is worth pausing on what kind of story it is before examining how it was told. The 13th century text known as Erik's Saga Rauda, preserved in the Hauksbok and Skaldalsbok manuscripts, is one of the two great Vinland narratives. Its roots lie in oral transmission that likely began among the Greenland settlers themselves, men and women who had crossed the Denmark Strait and built farms on ice-edged shores, and who kept the story of their founding alive in exactly the way that founding stories always survive, through repetition, pride, embellishment, and the natural human desire to make a difficult past sound like a necessary prelude to something greater. By the time any version of that story reached a skald performing on a ship, it carried all of that freight, the outlawry, the ocean crossing, the naming of an unknown land, the improbable survival of a community at the far margin of the Norse world. Each element was already shaped for dramatic effect, already carrying the weight of a story that people had told because they needed to tell it. What the saga then does is extend the chain westward. Leif Erikson, Erik's son, takes the narrative forward in a move that mirrors and amplifies his father's arc. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif was sailing back from Norway when his ship was pushed off course, or depending on which version you follow, he was specifically pursuing rumour of land seen by another sailor, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had glimpsed an unknown shore and sailed past it without landing. What Leif found was a sequence of coasts running south: Helluland, the flat stone country, almost certainly Baffin Island; Markland, the forested shore, almost certainly Labrador; and finally a place he named Vinland, the land of wine, where wild grapes grew and timber stood in abundance, and the winter was mild enough to make a man who had grown up in Greenland feel he had found something close to paradise. He wintered there with a small crew and brought the news back to Greenland, where it immediately became the kind of story that is impossible to contain. Here is where the maritime character of the saga becomes most vivid and most telling. Think about what this story would have meant to an audience at sea. A longship crew crossing the North Atlantic, pushing past the sight of any known land, living entirely within a universe of grey water and wind and the anxious daily reckoning of position, would have heard the saga of Erik the Red not as a tale from the distant past, but as a mirror of their own situation extended into legend. The themes were not abstract. Outlawry leading to a westward voyage leading to survival and settlement leading to rumours of lands still further west, richer, warmer, stranger. Every element of that chain corresponded to a lived reality that every man on a longship understood in his body. The obligation to follow the sea when everything else was closed off, the reading of ocean conditions for evidence of unseen coastlines, the psychological weight of open water pressing on the mind when no landmark had been visible for days. The saga gave that anxiety a shape and a precedent. Erik had been cast out and had found Greenland. Leif had pushed further and found Vinland. The implicit logic was unmistakable. The Western Ocean was not a void. It was a road, and the men who had the courage and the seamanship to sail it had always found something on the other side worth finding. Leadership in particular is a thread the saga handles with care. Erik the Red is not a simple hero. He is violent, driven out twice before he finds his place, capable of inspiring loyalty but also of attracting the kind of enemies that violent men tend to accumulate. Leif is differently shaped, more pragmatic, more open to the Christian faith he encountered in Norway and brought back to Greenland, navigating between the old world his father represented and the new possibilities the Western Ocean held. What the saga presents, in both of them, is leadership tested by ocean conditions. The ability to hold a crew together across water that offered no reassurance, to make decisions about when to push forward and when to turn back, to read risk correctly in circumstances where being wrong meant disappearing without trace. Those were exactly the qualities a longship crew would have valued hearing celebrated in the men of an earlier generation. A story about leadership at sea, told at sea, carries a different charge than the same story told on land. There is also the element of rumour, which runs through the saga like a current. Bjarni Herjolfsson had glimpsed the coast and not landed. Leif had heard about it and gone. The story passed from mouth to mouth in Greenland for years before later expeditions followed Leif's route. What this tells us about how the saga worked in oral performance is that it was built around the way knowledge actually travels in a maritime world, imperfectly, in fragments, through the accounts of men who had been somewhere and come back with descriptions that the next man had to decide whether to trust. A sailor listening to this saga on a longship would have recognized the epistemology immediately. It was the same epistemology he lived by every time he evaluated a rumour about a harbour or a passage, or a coastline described by someone who had been there once, years ago, in different conditions. The saga of Erik the Red was written down centuries after the events it describes, and it carries all the complications that follow from that distance: Christian editorial shaping, genealogical ambitions, literary conventions borrowed from a wider European tradition. Scholars have debated for generations exactly how much of its detail is reliable, but the archaeological record offers a striking counterweight to that scepticism. Lons o Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, preserves the physical remains of a Norse settlement that dates to precisely the period the saga describes. The story of westward ocean crossing was not invented. It was real, and it happened roughly where the oral tradition said it happened, carried across the Atlantic in the memories of people who had made the crossing themselves. That fact would not have surprised anyone who first heard the saga aboard a ship heading west into open water. The ocean was the common ground between the story and the life. What Erik and Leif had done, those listening men were also doing, following the sea wherever it led, trusting that something lay beyond the horizon and carrying the stories forward to whoever came next. But the saga of Erik the Red was not the only way the story was told. Running alongside it, preserving a different sequence of events and a different cast of leading figures, is the saga of the Greenlanders, the Greenlandinga Saga, and the divergences between the two texts are not merely academic puzzles. They are evidence of how oral tradition actually works, multiple threads running in parallel, each preserving a genuine strand of memory, while shaping it according to the audience that kept it alive. If the saga of Erik the Red read like a founding legend built around a single dynasty, the saga of the Greenlanders reads more like a community record, broader, more episodic, less tidily heroic, and in some ways considerably darker. The most striking structural difference concerns where the story begins. In the saga of the Greenlanders, it is not Leif Erikson who first sights the unknown western shores. It is Bjarni Herjolfsson. Bjarni was sailing from Iceland to Greenland around 985 or 986 when storms pushed him off course, and he found himself looking at a coastline that did not match any description of Greenland he had ever heard. Wooded, low, with no glaciers. He looked at it. He did not land. He turned north, found Greenland, and reported what he had seen. The saga of Erik the Red essentially erases him from the discovery sequence, folding his sighting into a rumour that Leif later acts on. The saga of the Greenlanders preserves him, and his presence matters, because a man who sees something extraordinary and sails past it without landing is a very different kind of figure than the confident discoverer, and his story carries a very different kind of lesson about the relationship between opportunity and hesitation at sea. After Bjarni, the saga of the Greenlanders traces 6 separate western voyages, each one reaching further into the geography of the new lands or attempting to establish something more permanent than the last. Leif goes west and makes the landfalls his father's saga also records. His brother Thorvald follows, exploring with more ambition and considerably worse luck. Then Thorstein, another brother, attempts to recover Thorvald's body and is turned back by bad weather, surviving long enough to die of illness in Greenland before his own voyage properly begins. Then Thorfinn Karlsefni, a merchant of considerable reputation, leads the most serious colonization attempt, an expedition that includes livestock, extended families, and the genuine intention of staying. And finally Freydis, Erik's daughter, makes a voyage that ends in an act of violence so disturbing that the saga lingers on it with an unease that feels unresolved even across the centuries. This sequence does something the single-strand narrative of the saga of Erik the Red does not. It creates a sustained portrait of ambition running repeatedly against the same wall, and that wall being not just geography, but the fundamental difficulty of maintaining a settlement at the absolute limit of the world, you know. The geography itself is worth dwelling on, because the names the sagas attach to the western landfalls are not merely placeholders. They are compressed descriptions of what a Norse sailor encountered when he sailed that coast from north to south. Helluland, stone slab land, is almost certainly Baffin Island, barren, flat-rocked, stripped of vegetation, offering nothing a settler could use. Markland, woodland, is almost certainly Labrador, forested, resource-rich in a specific and practical way, the timber coastline that treeless Greenland desperately needed. And Vinland, wineland, is the country where wild grapes grew alongside self-sown wheat, where salmon ran larger than any the Greenlanders had seen before, and where the winter was mild enough to strike men raised on ice and rock as close to miraculous. Each name is an assessment. A sailor who had never been to those waters but who carried those names in memory would have known, before he ever saw the shore, what kind of coast he was approaching and what it could offer. Helluland, keep moving. Markland, timber, note the position. Vinland, here is why we came. The geography of wonder and the geography of practical navigation were not separate categories in these stories. They were the same category described from 2 different angles, and the saga held both simultaneously. That dual function, legend and practical lore at once, is precisely what made these stories worth carrying on a ship. The Vinland Sagas were composed 2 centuries after the events they describe, and only written down in the early 14th century. But the oral memories they codified were circulating among Greenlandic and Icelandic sailors long before any manuscript existed, passed through generations of people who needed to remember that there was timber to the west, and grapes, and a coastline that ran in a particular direction from a particular bearing. The names of the 3 lands worked as navigational mnemonics. The sequence of the voyages provided a kind of experiential record. Here is what you encounter going south. Here is where fresh water can be found. Here is what the inhabitants of that country are capable of. The word the sagas use for those inhabitants, Skrellings, is the same word used for both the Vinland peoples and the Inuit encountered in Greenland, a term that carries contempt but also wariness, and the warnings embedded in the saga narratives about conflict with them were the kind of warnings you would want a crew to carry in memory before they approached an unfamiliar shore. What the saga of the Greenlanders is less comfortable about than most adventure narratives is how the ambition ended. Thorvald Eriksson pushes deeper into Vinland than Leif had gone, and his curiosity leads him directly into the first serious confrontation with the Skrellings. He is struck by an arrow and dies of the wound, telling his companions with a kind of dry understatement that the saga's favour that he had found, a fine place to spend eternity, and asking them to bury him on the headland he had admired. His death is not a catastrophe in the narrative. It is almost expected, the price of going further than the last man went, the toll the ocean and the new country levied on ambition. But it is the opening note of a darker chord. Karlsefni's attempt at permanent settlement is the most fully developed episode, and the saga gives it enough detail. The birth of his son Snorri, the first European child born in the Americas, the trading relations with the Skrellings that soured into violence, the winters that tested the colony's cohesion, to suggest that whoever kept this story remembered it as a genuine historical attempt, not merely as legend. The colony lasted perhaps 3 years before the combination of conflict and sheer logistical impossibility of supplying a settlement that far beyond the edge of the Norse world forced Karlsefni to bring his people home. 3 years was not nothing, but it was not enough. And then there is Freydis. Whatever happened in Vinland on her expedition, the saga's account of her engineering the murder of rival settlers and killing women herself when the men refused, reads less like saga convention than like the preservation of a scandal that no amount of retelling had managed to smooth over. She returned to Greenland with the goods from those she had killed and tried to buy silence. It did not fully work, which is perhaps why the story survived in the form it did. The saga of the Greenlanders does not resolve her. It simply records what was remembered. What those accumulated records add up to is something more honest than triumph. 6 voyages to the western lands and no permanent settlement. A geography named and partly understood, a coast that offered timber and grapes and the tantalizing promise of a place large enough to absorb the overflow of a Norse world, already pressing against its own edges, and still nothing held. The distance was too great. The supply lines did not reach. The people already living there had no reason to accommodate Norse expansion. The road to Vinland was real. The archaeological certainty of Lonso Meadows confirms that men and women stood on that Newfoundland shore and built structures there that have survived 1,000 years, but the road, once found, could not be kept open. And the sagas that described it carried that truth alongside the wonder, the knowledge that the ocean gives and the ocean takes back, and that the most remarkable voyages in the world are not always the ones that end in settlement. So the sagas say a coast was found, named, briefly settled, and ultimately abandoned. But for nearly 7 centuries after Karlsefni's people sailed home to Greenland, that was all it was, a story. A compelling one, circulated in manuscripts copied by Icelandic monks, argued over by scholars who disagreed about whether it was history or elaboration, geography or metaphor. The Norse voyages to the western Atlantic existed in the same ambiguous category as many medieval accounts, credible in outline, impossible to verify, and therefore always one step away from being reclassified as legend. That changed in 1960, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, when a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Steen Ingstad asked a local fisherman whether he knew of any old ruins in the area. He did. He walked them to a series of low grassy mounds near the village of Lonso Meadows, and what the Ingstads began to excavate there over the following years was not ambiguous at all. 8 Norse-style structures emerged from the soil, sod-walled buildings with the same architectural profile as those found in Iceland and Greenland. A bronze cloak pin of a distinctly Norse type, spindle whorls, evidence of textile work, evidence of women, which the sagas had also described, and most decisively iron boat nails and the slag residue of a working forge. Iron smelting is not a practice associated with any indigenous culture of the region. It is a Norse signature, and it was sitting there in the ground of Newfoundland, approximately 1,000 years old, waiting for someone to ask the right question of the right fisherman. The precise date arrived much later, through a method the medieval storytellers could never have imagined. In 2021, a team of scientists used a rare spike in atmospheric radiocarbon caused by a solar storm in 993 CE, a spike that shows up as a distinct chemical marker in tree rings, to date timber cut at the Lonso Meadows site. The wood had been felled in 1021 CE 1 year, a precision that dendrochronology almost never achieves for medieval sites, and one that placed the Norse occupation of Newfoundland exactly 1,000 years before the study's publication. The story that had been passed across centuries of oral transmission, and then frozen in manuscripts and then argued over by scholars, was now anchored to a single year in the 11th century. The sagas had been telling the truth about something that actually happened. But archaeology is precise in ways that oral memory is not, and the precision of Lanceau Meadows also reveals where the sagas strain against the facts. The settlement fits the description of a forward base, a place to overwinter, process timber, repair ships, far better than it fits the image of the fertile grape-laden Vinland the texts describe. Wild grapes do not grow at Lanceau Meadows. The latitude is too far north. Self-sown wheat does not grow there either. If the name Vinland meant what the sagas implied, a land of wine and abundance, then the site on the northern Newfoundland tip is not Vinland proper. It is a gateway to something further south, a staging post from which Norse crews may have ventured down the coast into regions where grapes did grow, before returning to their base camp. This is where historical debate currently lives. Scholars who take the botanical clues seriously have proposed locations ranging from New Brunswick to Nova Scotia, to points further south still, and none of those proposals has been conclusively confirmed by excavation. The grapes remain in the saga and out of the ground. The wheat remains described but unlocated. Lanceau Meadows is the only confirmed Norse site in North America, which means it is both the greatest archaeological confirmation of the saga tradition and a reminder of everything that tradition still cannot resolve. What the site does confirm are the practical activities that the sagas mention almost in passing: the timber cutting, the ironwork, the short-term occupation. These are the working details, the logistical notes embedded in narratives that were primarily interested in the drama of discovery and the tragedy of failed settlement, and their survival in the oral record is itself significant. When a community of people passes a story through generations, the details that persist tend to be the ones that mattered practically, the details that told a sailor something useful about what to expect, what to bring, what to do when he got there. The iron forge at Lanceau Meadows is in the ground because someone built it. The memory of boat nails being made on the Vinland coast persisted because it was the kind of information that a sailor needed to carry. Oral transmission filters toward usefulness, and the archaeology keeps finding the useful things. The contradiction between grapes in the saga and no grapes at the site is not a failure of the tradition. It is a trace of how the oral record actually accumulates. Different crews went different distances. Different storytellers preserved different voyages. The name Vinland, once attached to whatever fertile coast someone encountered south of the timber shore, became a destination in the narrative whether or not every version of the story was describing the same specific location. The oral memory preserved the emotional and navigational core, timber here, grapes further south, difficult people throughout, and let the precise geography blur in exactly the way geography blurs when it is transmitted in words rather than coordinates. The two sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Erik the Red, disagree on ship numbers, on who led which expedition, on the sequence of events. Written down 2 centuries after the voyages and not fully codified until the early 14th century, they carry all the marks of parallel oral traditions that were never fully reconciled before being committed to parchment. Scholars have spent decades arguing about which account is closer to the original events, and reaching no consensus, because the question assumes a kind of archival fidelity that oral tradition simply does not provide. What oral tradition does provide is durability. The broad shape of the story, the western coast, the hostile encounters, the failed colony, survived intact across nearly 3 centuries of telling before anyone wrote it down, and the excavated ground of Newfoundland confirmed that the broad shape was true. That is the discovery that captured the world's attention in 1960 and has not let it go since. There is something extraordinary about the moment when a shovel hits the edge of a Norse building foundation on the coast of North America, and the story that everyone half believed turns out to be half the picture of something real. The public imagination responds to that kind of confirmation with a force that purely academic history rarely generates, because it collapses the distance between a medieval manuscript and a physical place you can visit. Lanceau Meadows is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Visitors stand on the Newfoundland shore where the reconstructed sod buildings look out toward the same water the Norse ships crossed, and the 1,000-year gap between that moment and this one becomes briefly vertiginously thin. What really happened in Vinland was almost certainly messier, more episodic, and more ordinary than the sagas suggest. Real people cutting timber, smelting iron, trading badly, fighting, dying, and eventually leaving. But the oral tradition that carried those events forward was not trying to produce a field report. It was trying to preserve something worth remembering. The knowledge that the ocean to the west was crossable, that land was there, that it had been reached by people whose names were worth saying. And saying those names, across generations of firelit halls and open-deck recitations, kept the memory alive until the ground itself could confirm it. The Vinland Sagas preserved the edges of the known world, coastlines reached by a handful of ships, settlements measured in dozens of people, voyages so remote that centuries passed before anyone found the physical evidence. But the Norse oral tradition did not only carry stories of the extreme and the exploratory. At its centre, dense with political weight and naval detail, sat the histories of kings, and no single work gathered those histories more completely, or with more deliberate attention to ships, than the work compiled around 1230 by an Icelandic chieftain and scholar named Snorri Sturluson. Heimskringla, the name translates loosely as the Circle of the World, is a sequence of sagas tracing the kings of Norway from mythological origins down through the 11th and 12th centuries. Snorri was a politician as well as a writer, a man who understood power and the theatre that sustained it, and what he produced was not a dry chronicle. It was a living record of how Norse kingship worked, and at the operational heart of that kingship, on almost every significant page, was the ship. The connection makes complete sense once you understand how Norse royal authority actually functioned. A king without a fleet was a king without reach. Naval power was not an extension of political authority. It was the mechanism by which political authority was exercised, demonstrated, and contested. When a Norse king wanted to establish dominance, he built ships. When he wanted to intimidate a rival, he mustered a fleet. When he wanted to cement his reputation in the memory of his people, he gave his greatest ship a name and ensured that name was remembered. Snorri understood all of this, and Heimskringla reflects it on nearly every level. The shipbuilding narratives in the text are among its most vivid passages. The construction of Olaf Tryggvason's great dragon ship, the Orma in Langi, the Long Serpent, is described with a specificity that reads less like literary embellishment and more like technical memory. 34 bench pairs, high-sided hull. A prow worked into the form of a serpent's head and covered in gilt, with a matching gilded tail curling at the stern. It was the largest warship of its age by Snorri's account, and the care taken to record its dimensions and appearance suggests that the tradition treating it as something exceptional stretched back long before the text was written. The Long Serpent was not just a weapon, it was a statement, and statements of that kind require witnesses. Storytellers who carry the image forward in language precise enough to make later audiences feel the hull rising from the timber yards, plank by plank. Snorri's King's sagas name approximately 15 great ships with varying levels of detail. Vessels like the Trana and the Bussen catalogued alongside the Long Serpent, each with oar counts, dimensions and circumstances of construction or commission. The accumulation reads as more than historical inventory. It is a treasury of remembered vessels, a way of anchoring royal history to physical objects that had themselves become legend. In a culture where a ship was the most visible and costly expression of concentrated power, naming those ships in the oral record was a way of preserving the power itself, transmitting not just the event but the scale and ambition behind it. The fleet mustering passages carry that sense of scale into open water. In one of the saga's most dramatically charged sequences, Harald Hardrada assembles a war fleet of 150 ships and sails to confront a Danish fleet of 300. The central warship is positioned and the battle order established by trumpet signal. These are not the intimate details of a two-boat crossing to an unknown coast. They are the logistics of organised naval warfare on a dimension that demands a different kind of storytelling, broader, louder, built around the spectacle of mass movement across open sea. Snorri renders these scenes with an eye for the kind of detail that makes the listener feel the weight of oars shipping simultaneously across a fleet that stretches from horizon to horizon. For a skald performing aboard a longship, such material had obvious and immediate appeal. The crew listening were themselves sailors. They knew what it meant to maintain battle order at sea, to read the movements of another fleet across open water, to respond to a trumpet signal when the noise of wind and wave was already enormous. When a story about Harald Hardrada mustering his fleet was recited on a vessel underway, it was not abstract history. It was recognizable experience rendered at a grander scale, familiar enough to be credible, grand enough to be inspiring. The political drama of competing kings became, in that context, also a drama of seamanship and ship handling, and the crew who heard it were invited to place themselves within it. This is the deeper function that the King's Sagas served in oral performance. They were not simply entertainment or even morale building in a general sense. They were a means of transmitting the idea that naval competence and royal authority were the same thing, that the men who built great ships and marshalled great fleets were the men around whom history organized itself. For a crew who spent months at sea, who endured the same cold and wet and monotony that all Norse sailors endured, being connected through story to that tradition of royal seafaring was a form of dignity. It placed their voyage within a larger continuity of Norse maritime power. The skaldic verses embedded throughout Heimskringla reinforced this effect through form as much as content. Skaldic metre is demanding, strict syllable counts, intricate patterns of alliteration and internal rhyme, elaborate kennings that compress whole images into compound noun phrases. The difficulty of the form is also what makes it durable. A verse composed in strict skaldic metre cannot be paraphrased without being destroyed, and so the oral tradition that carried skaldic verse was forced toward precision. The kenning for a warship, something like the wave's horse or the sea flame, had to be reproduced correctly to function poetically, and that requirement locked the language in place across generations of transmission. When Snorri cited skaldic verses as evidence for his narrative, he was doing something historically significant, treating the formal demands of the verse tradition as a guarantee of textual stability, a primitive but functional version of archival integrity. It is worth noting that Snorri wrote roughly 2 centuries after many of the events he describes, and that some of his ship details likely reflect shipbuilding practices of the early 13th century rather than those of the 10th or 11th. The Long Serpent's gilt prow may be as much architectural dream as historical record, but the function those descriptions served in oral transmission does not depend on their exact accuracy. What mattered was that they were specific, that they attached royal reputation to concrete, physical detail, and that the detail was vivid enough to survive in memory. A ship with 34 bench pairs and a gilded serpent's head is a ship you can picture. A ship you can picture is a ship you can describe to the next crew who asks you what Olaf Tryggvason built. In this sense, Heimskringla is not quite what it appears to be on its surface, a royal history in the conventional sense, organised around the succession of Norwegian kings. It is underneath that structure a repository of maritime memory. The kings are present because the ships are present. The battles are significant because they were fought at sea. The political order of the Norse world was a nautical order, and Snorri had the insight and the access to enough skaldic verse and oral tradition to record it that way. The result is a text that preserves, embedded within its accounts of succession and conflict, a detailed and emotionally resonant picture of what it meant to hold power in a world where power moved by water. Every fleet muster, every named dragon ship, every trumpet signal across the battle line is also a record of the sea itself, of how it shaped the men who sailed it, the kings who depended on it, and the stories that kept all of that alive long after the fleets had dispersed and the great ships had gone to timber and rust. So Snorri named them. He named them carefully, with the precision of someone who understood that a ship's name was not an administrative detail, but a condensed argument about the kind of vessel it was, and the kind of king who owned it. Omarin Langi, the Long Serpent. The name arrives in the saga tradition not as a label, but as a declaration, and it functions that way every time it appears in the text. Consider what that name does in the ear of someone who has never seen the ship. It is already an image. A serpent is sinuous, dangerous, low and fast in the water, and capable of sudden violence. Call it long, and you have added scale. The threat elongated, the hull stretched towards something that does not quite fit within normal expectations of what a ship can be. The Long Serpent was built for Olaf Tryggvason in the late 990s, and by Snorri's account it carried 34 pairs of rowing benches, which puts roughly 68 rowers at the oars on a calm day. Extrapolated from the proportions of comparable vessels like the Gokstad ship, that oar count suggests a hull somewhere in the range of 45 metres, 148 feet of moving timber, high-sided with a dragon-headed prow worked in gilt and a gilded tail curling at the stern to match. It was the largest warship of its era, and the saga knows it. Every passage that names the Long Serpent is also making a claim about Olaf Tryggvason, that he was the kind of king who could conceive of such a vessel, commission it, and put it on the water. What is striking about the skaldic poem known as the Eiriksflokka is that the name Ormrin Langi recurs within it almost as a refrain, a repeated return to the ship as if it were a character in its own right, rather than simply a platform for characters to stand on. This was not accidental. The naming convention in the Norse tradition was built on the same structural logic as the kenning, that compressed poetic compound that replaces a direct description with an image. When a skald called a warship the Wave's Horse, he was not being decorative. He was encoding the vessel's nature, its relationship to the sea, its movement, its purpose, into a phrase that could not be summarized without being diminished. Ship names worked the same way. Ormrin Langi is a kenning in proper noun form. It tells you the shape, the length, the menace. It does in 3 syllables what a technical description might take a paragraph to approximate. Snorri's Heimskringla is full of these names, and they do not all carry the same register. Trana, the crane, suggests height and elegance, a vessel that rides the water differently from a serpent, that commands through bearing rather than raw threat. Visund, the bison, implies mass, and the kind of forward momentum that comes from weight rather than speed. And then there is the bussen, the large war and transport vessel that represents a slightly different category of ship altogether. Where the Long Serpent belonged to a tradition of purpose-built royal warships, the buss was a broader class, often carrying 35 or more oar pairs and a hull wide enough, 7 to 10 metres of beam, to handle both men and cargo across open water. The Bussen class spans a long period, and does not resolve into a single standardized type, but the vessels associated with it in saga tradition, including examples linked to figures like Inga Haraldsson, share characteristics that push them toward the upper limit of what the Norse shipbuilding tradition could produce. High freeboard, dragon-head prow, the same deliberate theatricality as the Long Serpent, translated into a somewhat more practical hull form. When these vessels are named in oral performance aboard a ship at sea, something shifts in the quality of attention. The crew listening are not hearing about abstract hardware. They know what 35 oar pairs mean in terms of labour, the organised effort, the timing, the collective breath that goes into keeping a hull moving at speed through open water. They know what a dragonhead prow looks like from another vessel approaching on a grey morning, and they know what it is meant to communicate. So when a skald names the Long Serpent in the middle of a battle narrative, the crew is not being informed of something foreign. They are being invited to measure the familiar against the legendary, to hold what they know about ships against what the great ships were capable of, and to feel the distance between the ordinary and the exceptional as something charged with both aspiration and awe. The naming of ships also did something useful for the practical function of storytelling. A named vessel can accumulate narrative. The Long Serpent was not just the ship on which Olaf Tryggvason fought his last battle at Svöld around the year 1000. It was the ship he had spent political capital and technical mastery building. It was the vessel that embodied his reign's ambition, that appeared at fleet musters and carried his banner across water that other ships would not attempt. By the time it enters the battle account, the audience already has a relationship with it, or if they are hearing the saga for the first time, the accumulated references have built a context that makes the battle feel like the culmination of something larger than a single engagement. The ship is the continuous thread. The king changes, decisions are made, alliances shift and fracture, but the Orm in Langi persists through all of it as a fixed point around which the story can organise itself. For modern historians and ship reconstructors, the names carry a different but related significance. The specific technical details preserved in the saga accounts, oar counts, room numbers, length inferences, descriptions of hull height and prow construction, provide data that archaeology alone cannot always supply. The 34 room count for the Long Serpent aligns in useful ways with what archaeologists have measured at Gokstad, allowing scholars to build credible models of a vessel, no physical trace of which has survived. The bussy dimensions, imprecise as they are across the class's centuries-long span, help differentiate large late Viking vessels from the earlier longship types, and suggest how the Norse shipbuilding tradition adapted to the demands of longer voyages, heavier cargoes, and more complex military logistics. The names, in other words, are not just poetry. They are preserved specifications, incomplete, sometimes exaggerated, written down centuries after the events they describe, but grounded in a tradition of observation precise enough to be useful. And yet the technical dimension, though real, is not what made the names matter to the people who first used them. A crew on a longship in the middle of the North Sea, days out from any shore, hearing the name Orkneyinga spoken in the middle of a recited saga, was not thinking about hull ratios. They were hearing a symbol of what naval power looked like at its most complete and concentrated, a king's will translated into timber and oar and gilded serpent head, sent across the water to announce itself to the world. They were hearing proof that ships could be more than tools, that a vessel capable of becoming legend was also capable of shaping history, and that the tradition they themselves were part of, the tradition of Norse men going to sea in wooden hulls and returning with stories worth telling, extended back through decades and centuries to the greatest ship ever built in those northern waters. The name carried all of that. The Long Serpent, 34 pairs of oars, a prow that watched the horizon with a gilded eye. Whatever the exact dimensions, whatever the precise date of construction, whatever liberties Snorri may have taken in setting the details down 200 years later, the name arrived with the weight of everything it had meant, and on a ship at sea, that weight was felt. The Long Serpent belonged to a king and a court, to the world of Norwegian royal ambition that Snorri chronicled with such deliberate care. But saga culture did not stay in Norway. It travelled, aboard the same ships that carried settlers and raiders and traders out beyond the horizon, and when it arrived somewhere new, it took root in the local ground and grew into something that carried both the original inheritance and the particular character of where it had landed. Nowhere is that process more visible than in the Northern Isles, and in the saga that the Orkney archipelago eventually generated for itself. The Orkneyinga Saga, its Old Norse title translates literally as the history of the Earls of Orkney, was composed by an unknown Icelandic author around the year 1200. The original 12th century text has not survived intact, but reworked versions appear in the great manuscript collections of the early 13th century, among them the Fletti Jarbok and the Codex Wormianus, two of the most important repositories of Norse saga material. What those manuscripts preserve is something unusual in the saga tradition. Not a king's saga, not a family saga centred on an Icelandic household, but a regional saga, a sustained narrative organised around a line of jarls, earls, governing a specific island group on the far periphery of the Norse world. The story the saga tells begins with a legendary grant. When Harald Fairhair consolidated his power over Norway around 875, the islands of Orkney and Shetland were, by the saga's account, handed over to a line of Norse earls as a kind of political settlement, dependent on the Norwegian crown, but governing their own affairs across the sea. From that founding grant the narrative runs through roughly 30 jarls across 3.5 centuries, ending with the murder of Jon Haraldsson in 1231, after which the Norse earldom effectively dissolved, and the islands began their long drift toward the Scottish crown that would be formalised 2 centuries later. In the space between those poles, the saga covers feuding families, disputed earldoms often split between brothers or cousins with competing claims, and the persistent political tension of dual allegiance. The earls bound simultaneously to the Norwegian crown and to the Scottish kings whose territory lay just to the south, a geographic and political reality the saga returns to again and again without ever quite resolving. That unresolved tension is not a flaw in the narrative. It is the condition the narrative is trying to make sense of. The Earls of Orkney were not Norwegians who happened to govern islands. They were not Scots who happened to speak Norse. They occupied a position in between, defined by sea roads running in multiple directions at once, south to Scotland and England, east to Norway, west toward Iceland and beyond. The saga reflects that world accurately, which is part of why it remains such a valuable document. The islands it describes were a crossroads rather than a margin, and the stories it tells are shaped by the particular pressures that come from governing a crossroads. The shifting coalitions, the sudden reversals of loyalty, the violence that tends to accompany disputed inheritance, when geography makes it easy to arrive by ship and equally easy to leave before the consequences catch up with you. What the saga was doing for the communities who heard and preserved it goes beyond recording political history. Its stated purpose, preserved in the text itself, was to provide a history of the islands that would allow its readers, or more precisely its listeners, to to understand themselves through a knowledge of their origins. That formulation is worth sitting with. Understanding yourself through origins is not the same as simply knowing facts about the past. It implies a relationship between the present community and the ancestral narrative, a sense that the stories of the earlier earls are not finished, but are instead the foundation on which current identity stands. For scattered Norse communities across the North Atlantic, communities separated from Norway by weeks of sailing, and from each other by the conditions of island life, that kind of narrative anchor was not a luxury. It was a mechanism for remaining coherent. The sea roads that linked Orkney to the wider Norse world were also the routes along which the saga material travelled. A vessel crossing from Norway to the Northern Isles in the 10th or 11th century might carry a skald whose repertoire included praise poems about the earls, or oral accounts of feuds and battles that had been retold across multiple generations. The islands themselves preserved memory in their place names, many of which appear in the saga with the casual familiarity of someone writing about a landscape they expect the audience to recognise. Ness and Wick and Voe, headland and bay and inlet, those names were not just geography, but biography, each one attached to events the saga had no need to explain because the audience already knew them. By the time an Icelandic author set the material down around 1200, the accumulated oral tradition was already rich enough to carry its own weight across centuries. What the saga also carries, woven through the political narrative and the genealogical record, is a maritime identity that is not limited to Orkney. The earls fought at sea, negotiated by sea, were betrayed and avenged by sea. Their authority depended on their ability to put ships on the water when needed, to assemble a fleet that could defend the islands or project power toward the Scottish coast, or carry tribute to Norway without embarrassment. When the saga describes a fleet muster, or a sea battle in the channels between the islands, it is drawing on the same tradition that produced the Long Serpent and the ship-naming conventions of Heimskringla. The vessel as a measure of power, the voyage as the moment when allegiance is attested, the sea crossing as the action that determines who matters and who does not. These are not uniquely Orcadian themes, they are Norse themes, and the Orkneyinga Saga carries them to a specific place while keeping them legible to anyone raised in the wider tradition. That portability is part of what makes regional sagas significant in ways that go beyond local history. The Orkneyinga Saga did not stay in Orkney. It circulated in Iceland, where it was written down, and it was preserved in manuscript collections that contained material from across the Norse world. Someone in Iceland reading or hearing the saga in the early 13th century was encountering a narrative that reinforced their own sense of belonging to a maritime culture that extended from Norway through the islands of the North Atlantic and all the way to the edges of the British Isles. The specific Earls of Orkney, their names, their feuds, their sea routes, were local content, but the framework that made the content meaningful was shared. That is what saga culture did as it travelled with Viking settlement. It was not simply a form of entertainment, though it was certainly that. It was the technology by which dispersed communities remained parts of a single culture, rather than drifting into isolation. A Norse settler in Orkney in the 10th century had more in common with a Norse settler in Iceland than either of them had with their immediate neighbours, who spoke a different language and organised their social world differently. What maintained that connection across hundreds of miles of open water was not trade alone, or kinship networks alone, but the shared body of narrative. The same names, the same ships, the same ancestors invoked when someone needed to establish who they were and where they came from. The Orkneyinga Saga is, in that sense, a record of how far the tradition could travel without losing itself. The islands at the edge of the Norse world produced their own history, their own line of earls with their own rivalries and alliances and violent ends. But they told that history in a form inherited from the same culture that named the Long Serpent, and sent skalds to stand at the prow of a longship in the North Sea and speak the past aloud to men who needed to remember it. The Orkneyinga Saga positioned those islands as a crossroads, but the crossroads itself was only one node in a network that stretched far beyond the Northern Isles in every direction. Norse seafarers did not simply move between Orkney and Norway and back again. They moved in an enormous arc, south along the western British coast, through the Irish Sea and around the headlands of Wales and Cornwall, north again through the Hebrides, and east across the face of Scandinavia into the Baltic, probing the coastlines of peoples who traded in amber and furs and silver. The sea roads, plural, radiated outward from every harbour that Norse ships could reach, and the sagas followed all of them. The Orkneyinga Saga itself makes this explicit in its account of Rognvald Eysteinsson, who is credited with establishing the Norse earldom of the islands under Harald Fairhair. The fleet that secured Orkney and Shetland did not stop there. The saga records those same ships continuing south to Scotland, to Ireland, to the Isle of Man, each name in that list marking a point on a continuous sea corridor that linked the Northern Isles to the Irish coast through a chain of anchorages and landfalls. That corridor was not abstract geography. It was a route that generations of Norse ships had travelled, and each point along it carried associations that accumulated over time. Who held it? Who had tried to take it? Which harbour was safe in a westerly wind and which would trap a ship against a lee shore if the weather turned? This is where the sagas begin to function as something more than narrative. They became, through repeated telling, a form of inherited mental map, a way of encoding navigational and political intelligence inside stories that could be carried in a person's memory without any need for parchment or compass. When a skald described a raid down the Caithness coast, naming the headlands and the settlements in the order they appeared from the sea, the audience did not just hear a story about violence and strategy. They absorbed a sequence of landmarks, filed away in the same memory that held the names of the characters and the outcome of the fighting. Generations later, someone planning a crossing of the same waters could draw on that inherited knowledge without realizing it was knowledge, because by then it had become simply the way things were, the shape of the world as Norse culture understood it. The Baltic tells a different version of the same story. Where the western sea roads connected Norse settlements to the British Isles and Ireland, the eastern routes linked Scandinavia to a trading world of extraordinary reach, one that extended through the river systems of what is now Russia, all the way to Byzantium and the markets of the Islamic Caliphate. The first node in that network, the one that appears most frequently in the early sources, was Hedeby, the great emporium near the base of the Jutland Peninsula, a skaldic stanza preserved from the period records that a ship could sail from Syrinskiel, the Norwegian port now identified with Skiringsala, to Hedeby in 5 days, naming both terminals with the casual precision of someone who has made the crossing and expects the audience to know exactly what those 5 days involve. From Hedeby, the routes continued east. The 9th century merchant Wulfstan left a remarkably detailed account of the passage from Hedeby to the mouth of the Vistula, a voyage he completed in 7 days and nights. His itinerary names the islands and coasts passed in sequence: Vendland to starboard, then Bornholm, Blekinge, Møre, Öland, and Gotland, stretching along the port side as the ship worked eastward. That list is not a bureaucratic inventory. It is a sailing direction embedded in prose, and it corresponds closely to the kind of root knowledge that Norse oral culture was systematically preserving in verse and saga throughout the same period. Whether Wulfstan's account influenced saga transmission or simply paralleled it, the structure is identical, a sequence of named places, each one a landmark and a reference point, arranged in the order they appear from the deck of a moving ship. Gotland occupied a particular position in this eastern network. The Gutta Saga, a 13th century account of the island's history, records its long-standing relationship with the Swedish realm and confirms what Wulfstan had already noted, that the island was effectively subject to Swedish authority, a political relationship that made it both a safe harbour and a point of leverage for anyone moving goods or men through the central Baltic. Gotland's harbours appear in saga material with a frequency that reflects their actual importance. They were places where a ship could resupply, where disputes could be settled among traders who shared enough common ground to negotiate, and when news travelled fast because everyone passing through was carrying information from somewhere else. What the repeated retelling of these routes accomplished, over decades and then centuries, was the creation of a shared geography of the Norse world, a mental atlas that existed not in any single document, but distributed across the memories of everyone who had heard the stories often enough to absorb them. A man who had never sailed east of Orkney, but who had grown up listening to skaldic verse could still carry a rough knowledge of where Hedeby sat in relation to the Jutland coast, and what lay beyond it if you kept sailing. This knowledge was not precise in the way that modern charts are precise, but it was good enough to orient a crew, to confirm a route decision, to reassure someone that what lay ahead was known territory, or at least known about territory, which in a world without charts is almost the same thing. The sagas also encoded something harder to measure than route knowledge, a map of enemies and allies, of which settlements were Norse-friendly and which were not, of where you could expect hospitality, and where you would need to land in force or not at all. Earl Thorfinn's campaigns across Caithness and down through the Irish Sea, preserved in the Orkneyinga Saga, embedded political intelligence in narrative, who the reliable allies were on the Scottish coast, which Irish kings had made and broken arrangements with Norse fleets, where the Irish sea trading ports sat relative to the raiding grounds. A crew hearing those accounts was not simply being entertained. They were being briefed, across a gap of generations, by men who had tested those waters and lived to report on them. This is the aspect of saga culture that becomes most visible when you step back from the individual texts and look at the network they collectively describe. The Norse world was not a territory with clear borders. It was a web of sea connections, extending from the Baltic coast to the Irish Sea, bound together not by political unity. The earls and kings of that world were constantly fighting each other, but by cultural coherence. The sagas maintained that coherence by ensuring that someone in Dublin who spoke Norse, and someone in Hedeby who spoke Norse, and someone in Orkney who spoke Norse, all shared enough common reference points to understand each other as participants in the same story. They might never meet. They might live and die within a few miles of their birthplace, but they inhabited the same imagined geography, the same narrative world, because the stories had travelled further than any individual person needed to. The sea was not what separated these communities from one another. That distinction matters more than it might seem. In the modern imagination, the ocean tends to appear as an obstacle, the thing that kept distant places apart before technology shrank the distances. In the Norse world, the sea was the opposite. It was the road, the most reliable means of connection, faster and more predictable than overland travel through territory that might be hostile or impassable. The sagas understood this instinctively, because they were products of a culture that had organised itself around water. When they embedded root knowledge and political memory inside stories, they were not supplementing the sea. They were using stories in the same way the sea was used, as a medium of connection across distances that would otherwise have meant isolation. Every harbour named in verse, every crossing measured in days and nights, every alliance or enmity recorded in saga, was another thread in a web that held the Norse world together across hundreds of miles of open water. The stories were the infrastructure. The infrastructure held because individual human beings made it hold. One voice, one vessel, one night at a time. All of that accumulated geography and political memory, the named headlands and the sea roads and the alliances tested across decades, existed in the end inside a person. It lived in the skald standing near the mast of a longship, somewhere on open water between Norway and Iceland or between Orkney and the Irish coast, reciting into the wind while his audience crouched around him on a deck that gave each man less space than a large dining table. Close your eyes for a moment and try to place yourself there. Not in the abstract idea of a Viking ship, but in the actual physical fact of one. The vessel is perhaps 20 metres long and 4 across at its widest point, carrying a crew of 30 or more men, their sea chests doubling as rowing benches. The deck is open to the sky. There is no shelter from the rain except a tent of skins rigged at the stern when the ship is at anchor. When it is underway, the wind comes in from wherever it chooses, carrying spray off the tops of waves that the hull meets with a hard, rhythmic shudder. Every surface is wet. The smell is salt and wool and the particular sharpness of wet wood under tension. Men are rowing or managing the sail or simply enduring, packed close enough that each can feel the body heat of the man beside him. Into this, a voice begins. The skald did not recite in the smooth, measured tone of a modern audiobook. He performed, which meant something closer to the full-throated projection of a man trying to be heard over wind and wave, and the creak of oar against thole-pin. The dominant poetic form he used, the metre known as drot kvet, gave him structural assistance. Its lines enforced a strict syllable count, bound together by internal rhyme and alliteration, that fell in predictable positions within each verse. What this produced when spoken aloud with any skill was something the listeners could feel as much as hear. A beat, a pulse, a pattern of emphasis that the ear could lock onto even when individual words were swallowed by weather. The rhythm itself was a kind of meaning before the meaning arrived. Alliteration did more than decorate the verse. It served as the skald's memory architecture. The consonant that anchored one half line had to echo in the other, which meant that if you remembered one end of a line, the structure pulled the other end after it. Kennings, those compressed figurative phrases that called the sea the whale road, and a ship the wave horse and blood the sweat of the sword, were similarly mnemonic. They were formulaic containers, preloaded with a specific sense and a recognizable shape that the skald could deploy when the larger composition required them without having to invent fresh language in real time. The poetry was engineered for reliable performance under conditions that made reliability very difficult. Those formulaic anchors also gave the skald his most essential tool: flexibility. Certain refrains appear repeatedly across skaldic verse, phrases functioning almost like structural hinges around which the narrative could be expanded or contracted on the fly. When the audience was attentive and the sea relatively calm, a passage could be extended, embellished, decorated with additional kennings or a new detail that had come to the skald's attention in the last port. When a squall was building to the northwest and the crew's attention was already beginning to shift toward the horizon, the same passage could be collapsed to its essential line and the story moved forward. The living quality of oral transmission was not a flaw. It was the design. Evidence from later written records and from the mechanics of the verse itself suggests that the experience of listening varied dramatically depending on what the sea was doing. On a quiet night at anchor, perhaps in the shelter of a fjord or behind an island screen while the crew waited out a contrary wind, the recitation could take on something like leisure. A full battle narrative from Heimskringla delivered with time for the audience to respond, to interrupt, to ask for a favourite passage to be repeated. These were the conditions in which the longest and most elaborate performances were possible, and probably the conditions in which new material was tried out and refined. The audience could signal what worked. The skald could adjust. Over many such nights, across many such harbours, a saga settled toward a version that held. But out on open water, working hard, the calculus shifted. When men were rowing against a headwind or managing lines in heavy weather, the skald who kept spirits up was not the one who attempted a 15-stanza genealogical digression. He was the one who knew which section of the verse hit hardest with the least preparation. The moment a famous ship turned into the wind and her bow lifted over a wave, the line where a king made an impossible choice and the kenning made it vivid in 4 syllables. He could drop down to something closer to chant, a rapid rhythmic cadence that matched the stroke rate of the oars, and gave the men something to pull against that was more than exhaustion. The saga became percussion. The story became synchronization. This is not speculation drawn from nothing. The men who sailed the reconstructed longship Sea Stallion of Glendalough in 2007 reported that the crew kept morale through singing and the recounting of saga material during the hardest stretches of the voyage. What they were rediscovering, without necessarily framing it in those terms, was the same functional logic that Norse crews had worked out over centuries, a voice giving form to shared experience, turning the misery of a long passage into a story already half told, one that everyone aboard was living and everyone aboard would one day retell. The communal act of listening on a cramped longship was not passive. Men who could not see the skald clearly could hear him if he pitched his voice right, and the listeners closest to him would have relayed the sense of what was being said to those further away through expression and response. A laugh passing through a crew tells you something arrived. A silence does too. The skald was reading his audience constantly, because his audience was 4 feet away from him and visibly, physically reacting to everything he said. This proximity gave the performance an intimacy that no later written saga could replicate. When the verse named a ship that the crew was currently sailing, or described a stretch of coast they had passed that morning, or recalled a king whose grandson was rowing on the portside bench, the fiction and the reality collapsed into each other. The story was not something the audience was watching from a distance. They were inside it. The sea outside the hull was the same sea the verse described. The voyage they were undertaking was already in some sense a saga in progress, one that the skald was shaping even as they lived it, and one they would carry in memory to the next landfall, where they would tell it again, differently, because the telling itself had changed by the time they arrived. This is why no one can recover the exact words heard on a medieval longship. The oral form was never fixed. Each performance was the saga at that moment, for those men on that sea. What survived into the written manuscripts of the 13th century was not a recording, but a crystallization, the version that had accumulated enough authority and enough repetition to earn the permanence of parchment. But under the words on the page, if you know where to listen, the rhythm is still there. The long line, the internal echo, the kenning that compresses an entire world into a compound noun. These are the fossils of a living form, preserved in the medium of writing, but shaped entirely by the demands of open water and wind. so the rhythm is there, fossilized in the text. But how much of what surrounds that rhythm actually happened? How much of it was already legend when the first skald recited it? And how much more legend accumulated in the centuries between the original performance and the moment a scribe in Iceland dipped his quill and began to write it down? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the central problem of saga scholarship, and they do not have clean answers. Start with the most basic obstacle. The sagas as we have them were written down between roughly 1220 and 1280, sometimes later. The Vinland Sagas, the Heimskringla, the Viking Sagas, all of them reached parchment in the 13th century, and many of the events they describe took place 300 or 400 years before that. The oral chain connecting a shipboard performance in the year 1000 to a manuscript copied in the year 1260 passes through approximately 10 or 12 human generations. Every link in that chain was a performance, and every performance was an act of interpretation. The skald who recited a verse about Leif Erikson in 1050 was already one generation removed from the voyage itself. The skald who recited it in 1100 was drawing on what the previous generation had passed down. By 1200, the verse had been reshaped by every audience it had ever pleased, every court it had entertained, every winter hall where it had earned its keep by being good rather than by being accurate. What this means, practically, is that the exact words spoken on a longship during the actual voyages are simply unknowable. Scholars who study oral tradition are clear on this point. Oral transmission leaves no concrete record of its original content. What we have are endpoints, not recordings. The manuscripts preserve a version that had accumulated enough authority to survive, but they cannot tell us what was shed along the way or what was added. The dating problem compounds this considerably. Individual verses and fragments embedded within the sagas may be genuinely old. Some scholars argue for 12th century composition. Others push certain passages back further, while a competing camp insists that what looks archaic was in fact constructed in the 13th century by writers skilled enough to mimic the old forms. The skaldic verse that appears in Heimskringla, for instance, is often cited as evidence for early dating because the metre and vocabulary are consistent with 10th and 11th century practice. But consistency with a style is not the same as originating in that period. A gifted 13th century poet who wanted his work to sound like it came from the age of Harald Hardrada could achieve that effect, and we have no way to call his bluff with complete confidence. Then there is the layer that sits most visibly on the surface of the written texts, the editorial hand of the scribes, and behind them, the institutional priorities of the church. By the time these stories reach parchment, Iceland and Norway were Christian societies. The men writing in the scriptoria had a set of values that did not entirely align with those of the Norse warrior culture the sagas described. In some cases, the adjustment was subtle, a battle described with a note about divine favour, a king's conversion treated as the turning point of his entire biography. In other cases, it was structural. Whole sections of later manuscript traditions, such as the expansive Flatey Jar book compiled in the late 14th century, added new material, short narrative episodes called thetir, additional sagas, explanatory passages that layered medieval Christian concerns directly onto older oral cores. Political motives worked the same way. A saga that legitimized a particular dynasty, that connected a ruling family to a famous ancestor, that positioned one earldom favourably against another. These were not neutral documents. They were arguments, made in the language of the past on behalf of present interests. Genealogical agendas were baked into the manuscript tradition from the beginning, and separating them from the older material is painstaking work that rarely produces certainty. Modern historians navigate this by treating the sagas primarily as literature, and only secondarily as history. That distinction sounds simple, but it requires a particular kind of discipline. When Snorri Sturluson describes the long serpent turning in the water at Svold, the image is so vivid, the narrative so controlled, that the temptation is to read it as reportage. It reads like an eyewitness account because it was designed to read that way. The literary power is the evidence of craft, not the evidence of fact. What historians actually do with a passage like that is extract what they can cross-check. Ship dimensions consistent with archaeological finds, tactical details consistent with other sources, place names verifiable against geography, and treat the remainder as valuable for what it reveals about how Norse culture understood itself, rather than as a transparent window onto what literally occurred. The results of that method have sometimes been striking. The Vinland Sagas described a coastline with specific features, a place where wild grapes grew, a shallow bay where the ships grounded, a promontory with a particular orientation. For a long time those descriptions were treated as embellishment or confusion. Then in 1960, Helge and Anne Steiningstad began excavating a site at Lons O'Meadows Meadows in Newfoundland and found Norse-era structures, iron boat rivets, and a spindle whorl. The sagas had not been precisely accurate in every detail, but something real was encoded in them. The archaeology confirmed the kernel. It did not confirm the whole story. That gap between the kernel and the whole story is where the problem of truth and memory lives. A saga can be partially confirmed and still substantially invented. It can preserve the name of a real ship while inventing the speech of the man who sailed her. It can accurately describe the coast of Newfoundland while entirely fabricating the dialogue between two characters standing on it. The confirmed detail does not validate the surrounding material. It simply demonstrates that the transmission chain carried some true things alongside the legendary ones, and that distinguishing between the two requires work that no amount of archaeological confirmation can fully resolve. And yet, and this is the part that keeps the sagas alive as more than museum objects, the uncertainty is not a flaw in the tradition. It is intrinsic to what the tradition is. These stories were never meant to be archives. They were meant to compel. A skald on a longship was not trying to produce an accurate account for future historians. He was trying to make 30 cold, exhausted men feel that their voyage had meaning, that the sea they were crossing was the same sea where famous men had tested themselves before them, that the hardship of the present moment was already part of a story worth telling. The beauty of the verse served that purpose. The dramatic compression of kenning served it. The genealogical connections that bound the audience to the characters in the saga served it. None of that required strict factual accuracy. It required emotional truth, and emotional truth is a different standard entirely. What scholars are left with, then, is something genuinely strange, a body of material that is simultaneously one of the most vivid records of medieval Norse life, and one of the least reliable in conventional historical terms. The sagas are not lying to us. They are doing something more complicated than lying. They are showing us how a culture understood its own past, which is never the same thing as showing us the past itself. The verses were shaped by every sea they crossed, every audience they pleased, every scribe who thought he understood the older material better than the man who gave it to him. The original shipboard version, the first night a particular story was spoken over open water, is gone as completely as the breath that carried it. That irretrievable quality is precisely why these stories still generate argument, still produce new scholarship, still pull readers in centuries after the last longship was hauled ashore. The question of what actually happened on those voyages has no final answer. The mystery is not a gap waiting to be filled. It is the condition the sagas were born into, and the condition they have lived in ever since. In the summer of 2007, something extraordinary happened in the waters between Denmark and Ireland. A longship put out from Roskilde harbour and began sailing west and north, threading through the open North Sea, rounding the northern coast of Scotland, and pushing down through the Irish Sea toward Dublin. The ship was called the Sea Stallion from Glendalough. She was 30 metres long, built of oak using the same techniques that Norse shipwrights had used in the 11th century, and she was crewed by roughly 70 volunteers who had signed on for one of the most demanding experimental archaeology projects ever attempted in Northern Europe. The Sea Stallion was a full reconstruction of the Skulderlev II longship, a vessel whose shattered remains had rested on the floor of Roskilde Fjord for 9 centuries before archaeologists recovered and studied her. The original ship had been deliberately sunk as part of a blockade sometime in the 1070s. She was built in Ireland, sailed to Denmark, and eventually sacrificed to protect a harbour. That biography alone was enough to establish her as a vessel that had made exactly the kind of long Atlantic crossing the sagas described. The reconstruction, built at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde over several years, was the attempt to understand what making that crossing actually felt like, not in theory, not through the filtered language of a 13th century manuscript, but in the body, in real weather, on real water. The voyage covered roughly 1,000 nautical miles and took approximately 6 weeks. What the crew encountered over those weeks dismantled whatever romantic notions they may have carried aboard. The North Sea did not cooperate with the schedule. Weather systems moved in without warning. Gusts reached 23 meters per second, the kind of wind that does not feel like weather so much as it feels like an argument you are losing. The hull moved the way a living thing moves, flexing and responding, which was exactly how it was designed to behave, but which was also disorienting for people accustomed to rigid modern vessels. Fresh water was strictly rationed. Sleeping arrangements amounted to wrapping yourself in whatever you had brought, and finding a section of open deck that was slightly less wet than the others. Seasickness was not an occasional inconvenience, but a recurring feature of the passage, and there was no retreat from it, no cabin, no enclosed space that offered separation from the motion. The project leaders were explicit about one of their central intentions. This was not only a test of the ship, it was a social experiment. They wanted to observe how a large group of contemporary people, strangers and friends mixed together, managed confinement, physical hardship, and the grinding monotony of long watches. The question was not just whether the hull could survive Atlantic swells, the question was whether the crew could. The answer they found is the part that matters most for understanding the sagas. During the long watches, during the hours when the wind dropped and the oars came out, and 70 people had to sustain the same repetitive physical effort for the same tedious stretch of water, the crew began to sing. They played music. They told stories. Not because anyone had instructed them to, not because it was written into the schedule, but because the situation demanded it. When you're cold and tired and still hours away from the next anchorage, and the sea around you looks exactly as it did 3 hours ago, the human instinct is to reach for narrative. The crew gathered in the evenings and recounted the events of the day in ways that were already, even within days of happening, taking on the qualities of story, the dramatic moments enlarged, the tedious stretches compressed, the near misses given the weight of significance they had barely registered in the moment. This is not a coincidence. This is the mechanism. What the Sea Stallion voyage revealed, almost incidentally, is that the social function of storytelling on a longship was not a cultural luxury that the Norse happened to practice. It was a practical necessity that any group of people in that situation would independently discover. The modern crew arrived at singing and narrative because there was no other workable way to sustain morale across weeks of exposure and fatigue. If you accept that, then you have to accept that every Viking crew that ever crossed the North Atlantic was doing the same thing. The skalds were not performing in a vacuum. They were addressing a need so fundamental that it required no education in Norse culture to understand. 70 21st century volunteers figured it out in a matter of days. The implications for reading the sagas are significant. When you encounter a verse in Heimskringla that describes the spray breaking over the bow, or a passage in the Vinland Sagas about the crew's mood, as the coast of Greenland faded behind them, you're not necessarily reading a literary convention imported from mainland European literary tradition. You may be reading the echo of a real moment, a skald standing on a wet deck, addressing people who were cold and afraid and needed to be reminded that their voyage had a shape, a story, a place in something larger than their immediate discomfort. The verse worked because it was spoken in exactly the conditions it described. Experimental archaeology cannot tell us what the skalds actually said. The Sea Stallion's crew did not sing in Old Norse, and the stories they told each other were not the Heimskringla. The gap between a modern reconstruction and an 11th century longship remains real, and nobody in the project was claiming otherwise. What the voyage could test, and did test, was the physical and psychological environment that produced the saga tradition. And what it found was that the environment is consistent with everything the tradition suggests. A ship that size in those conditions on those waters creates exactly the kind of human need that a skilled oral performer could serve. The skald was not decoration. He was infrastructure. There is something almost vertiginous about that continuity. The problem of truth and memory that haunts every attempt to read the sagas as history does not disappear in the light of the Sea Stallion experiment. We still cannot recover the original shipboard performances. We still cannot know what was shed from the oral tradition in the centuries before the manuscripts were written. But the experiment does something that the manuscripts alone cannot do. It closes the physical distance between the reader and the material. Standing on the deck of a reconstructed longship, watching Scotland disappear behind you in the mist, feeling the hull move beneath your feet and the wind press against your face, you are no longer reasoning about what those voyages might have been like. You are inside the conditions that generated the stories in the first place. The Sea Stallion returned to Roskilde the following year, having completed the round voyage. She now sits in the Viking Ship Museum alongside the archaeological remains of the original Skald ships. But the more lasting thing she carried home was the practical confirmation of something that scholars had long argued and that readers had long intuited, that the sagas are not literature that happens to be set on ships. They are literature that was born on ships, shaped by the specific demands of the sea, and sustained across generations because the conditions that created them never really changed. Every crew that crossed those waters needed what the skalds provided, and every audience that has opened a saga since has been, in some sense, drawing on the same need, the need to make the difficult passage mean something, to find in the shape of a story the thing that the raw experience alone cannot give you. Pull back far enough and you can see all of it at once. The skald standing at the prow with a verse in his mouth and a crew at his back. The manuscript sitting in a scriptorium in Iceland 2 centuries later, a monk's hand tracing the words that someone else's voice had kept alive across the open water. The excavation trench at Lonso Meadows, where archaeologists in the 1960s found the physical confirmation of something that oral tradition had been insisting was true for the better part of 1,000 years. The Sea Stallion heeling into a North Sea gust while her crew, unbidden and by instinct, reached for song. These are not separate stories. They are the same story in different registers, and the thread running through all of them is the act of telling. The Viking Sagas are often described as stories about the sea. That framing is accurate as far as it goes, but it understates the more striking fact. These were stories carried by the sea. They moved the way the ships moved, across open water, between coasts that had no other reliable connection, through weather that erased landmarks and reduced the known world to the hull underfoot and the sky overhead. A saga describing Erik the Red's exile and his slow westward push toward an unknown coast was not merely set in that environment. It was maintained in that environment, retold on the very kind of vessel that the narrative described by people who were living inside the same basic conditions: the cold, the rationed water, the changing colour of the ocean as the depth beneath the keel dropped away into the Atlantic dark. That is what made the tradition durable. Skaldic verses, and scholars have reliably dated some 967 stanzas to the period between 950 and 1110 CE, were composed for oral performance and only committed to parchment in the 12th and 13th centuries. For generations before the manuscripts existed, those verses survived because the circumstances that had generated them kept recurring. Every crossing of the North Sea, every passage toward Greenland or Vinland or the Baltic coast, recreated the social conditions under which the material had first been shaped. New crews heard old verses in the old context. The words found their mark because the situation was unchanged. What the sagas preserved inside that living chain of performance was something more complicated than adventure. They held exploration, the genuine dangerous world-extending push into coasts that no chart recorded and no authority had named. They held power. The political logic of kings and earls whose legitimacy rested partly on the stories told about them, and who understood that a skald with a good memory was a more reliable instrument of reputation than stone or silver. They held fear, the real fear of open water, of storms that arrived without announcement, of landfalls that might be the shore you had aimed for or might be something else entirely. And they held memory in the most practical sense. The accumulated navigational and social knowledge of a seafaring culture that had no other archive but the spoken word and the trained mind. The Vinland Sagas did not merely celebrate Leif Erikson's western crossing. They preserved, in distorted but recoverable form, the location of a settlement whose physical remains lay under the Newfoundland grass for 10 centuries before a shovel found them. The tree ring and radiocarbon dates at Lonso Meadows converge on roughly 1021 CE. The sagas had been pointing at that approximate date, and that approximate coastline all along. The oral tradition had kept a fact alive that no written record corroborated, kept it alive on longships, around fires, in the mouths of people who could not have known that future science would eventually confirm what they were saying. That survival was not guaranteed. It was the product of continuous human effort. Someone had to remember, someone had to perform, someone had to listen and carry the material forward to the next crew, the next crossing, the next dark stretch of water where the need for a story was not aesthetic but urgent. The skalds who served that function were not archivists in any institutional sense. They were more like load-bearing elements in a structure that would have collapsed without them. Not decoration, but, as the Sea Stallion's crew discovered for themselves, something closer to infrastructure, which leaves a question that the sagas themselves cannot answer and that no excavation can resolve. How much was lost? How much history crossed that threshold where a performance was not repeated, where the single person who held a particular verse or a particular sequence of events died or forgot or simply ran out of audiences? The manuscript tradition that eventually fixed the surviving material on parchment is what we have, and it is extraordinary. But the manuscripts are also the residue of a much larger oral world, and the ratio of what survived to what did not is unknowable. That uncertainty is not a reason to set the material aside. It is a reason to take it more seriously, to recognise that what we have is what made it through a genuinely difficult passage, preserved by the same mechanism that preserved everything else those crews carried: necessity, repetition, and the human refusal to let the dark have the last word. Imagine the final watch of a long crossing, the stars obscured by cloud, the shore, if there is one, still beyond the horizon, the crew gathered in whatever shelter the hull allows, listening to a voice that turns the black water and the wind and the uncertainty into a shape they can hold. The known world has given way to rumour. What lies ahead is still a question, and the only answer available for now is the one the skald is giving them, the story of people who made this crossing before, who survived it, who named what they found, and who came home. Whether any of that was precisely true mattered less than the fact that someone kept saying it. History, at its most fragile, is exactly that. The thing someone kept saying, out loud, on the water, in the dark.